Everyone is well. I hope you're all coping with the heat. I know it's going to be extremely hot one again down south today, so a big thank you for joining us today. The reason why we're all here today, today's webinar is focused on the future REC governance arrangements that we're proposing as part of phase 1 of the Code governance programme, and therefore our preparations within RECO to become that licensed code manager for the Retail Energy Code later this year. In terms of some introductions from myself, for those that might not know me, I'm Rachel Anderson, the Director of Corporate Affairs at RECO, and I will host today's session. In terms of format and what you can expect, we have scheduled about an hour and 50 minutes today. We expect the speaker presentations to take about 45 minutes of that, and therefore we've left a good proportion of time, about half an hour, for any of your questions. And we do really encourage you to provide any initial feedback to what we're outlining and proposing today. The reason why we're holding today is that we've reached a really important part of our preparation in terms of moving towards that future code manager model. We've recently reviewed all of our governance arrangements and our committee structures in light of the future code manager license requirements and the framework put forward by Ofgem. And we're now in a position to share that review and our proposed approach to that, and what transition to those new arrangements look like from our initial planning. And we're really keen to get your feedback. Today's webinar forms part of a broader programme of our engagement on all of this. We've recently started to speak to our existing committees under the REC, so I went to the change panel last week, and we've got sessions planned with some of our other committees over coming weeks. And that engagement is in addition to the ongoing conversations that we have with Ofgem and other code bodies and all of this. We are still working towards an expected licence grant at the end of November. That is still subject to final confirmation by Ofgem, and also our own successfully completing the remaining implementation assurance activities within RECO, but the project is fully on track, and therefore the plan is progressing full steam ahead for the 30th of November. With that in mind, some of the arrangements we're discussing today, like I said, is working assumptions, and we'll make clear where certain areas we're still discussing with Ofgem or with our committees on, but we wanted to have this webinar today to get your initial feedback and any views, and it really helps shape what our activities need to be within the organisation. Let's move on to some housekeeping. Really quickly, just from me, please do keep cameras and microphones switched off during the speaker presentations. We are recording today's session like all of our other webinars that we hold, and that's just for the benefit of some of our colleagues that can't join us today. As usual, we always host the recording of our slides on RECO's YouTube account, and we'll be sharing the slides, the recording from today, and any written questions and answers on our website. And please do feel free to share them with any of your colleagues that you think would find the session useful. We really do encourage you to ask us our questions. Like I said, we've built in a good 30 minutes to answer those for you today. Please type in your questions as you have them within the Q&A functionality within Teams. There is also an opportunity, if you'd like to directly speak to us, you can put up your hand within the Q&A session at the end. And a big thank you to the individual who did submit some questions on the SAF prior to this, and we've made sure we've built in your questions into the agenda today. We're going to ask you to complete a short survey at the end of today's session, so initially giving us your feedback and how well we've delivered for you today. And then again with the outputs, there'll be a survey that we share, and it's a really good opportunity for you to provide us some feedback in terms of areas that you'd like us to hold further sessions or webinars on. The more feedback we get from you in terms of the areas that you're most interested in, it really helps us build an events programme that meets your needs. So please do share us your feedback after today. Today's not the only engagement that we're doing in terms of our readiness with code reform. We are planning to hold another webinar after summer in terms of the new modification process, an area of key interest, I'm sure, for many of you today. So although we can answer initial questions in terms of the transitional approach to the new arrangements, if you've got more detailed questions around the new modification process, which we're calling it in the new world, rather than change process, it's a modification process, we'll hold a much more detailed webinar on that in coming months. Just in terms of the agenda then, we've kind of got three main sessions that we're going to be speaking to you all about. We're going to provide some initial context in terms of what code reform is intending to achieve, and then the recent governance review that's led to a number of proposed changes to the governance arrangements and our committees. But then that transitional approach to that new model and our new modification process that we're currently discussing with our REC committees. We'll then move to the second main part of the agenda, and that's all around the Stakeholder Advisory Forum. So its purpose and role within the new governance model, how it will interact and provide advice, important challenge to RECO as the code manager, and in this new world making decisions on code modifications. What our proposed composition is, which we're still waiting from Ofgem for, so what the membership of the SAF is looking like, but how the members will be nominated, elected, appointed, and that supporting guidance that we will provide as the code manager to support future SAF members. We recognise the nominations and election process is different to how we operate with existing REC committees, so we want to make sure it's as straightforward for potential SAF members as possible. So we'll go into some of that detail today. We'll then hear from our PM, who's going to be talking all around the mobilisation timeline for the SAF, and then our priorities beyond the establishment of the SAF and the broader programme, and the key activities for ECHO between now and expected licence grant at the end of November. We'll then move over to our Q&A, and hopefully there's plenty of questions that you have for us that we can answer for you today. The last bit from me in terms before I introduce our speakers today, I just wanted to say, if you've not been following code reform or the licensing process for RECO and Elexon in terms of phase 1 of code reform, please don't worry today. We're intentionally trying to build in some context into what we're saying today so that everyone can leave the session with a much clearer understanding of what's changing under the Retail Energy Code and what's staying the same, but also how you can be further involved as we reach licence grant later this year. So just in terms of our speakers, you've heard from me. I'm also joined by 3 members of the RECO team. We've got John Hawkins, who will start things off for us in just a moment. John is our Director of Market Design. He's leading all of the work on our future governance model, and we'll be talking all around that governance review that we've been undertaking. We've got Aisha as our code reform programme lead. She's overseeing all of our wider preparations for the new licence code manager arrangements, and also supporting me in establishing the new Stakeholder Advisory Forum, and she'll be giving much more context to the SAF in today's webinar. And we also have Tracy as our PM for the overall programme, and she's, as you'd expect, coordinating the detailed delivery for mobilisation activity between now and licence grant. So I really hope you find today useful. I'll just check if there's any questions. Have we received any initial questions from... So it's just loading for me. No initial questions. So on that note, what I'll do, I'll hand you over to John Hawkins for our first presentation.
Thanks, Rachel. Morning all. Can everyone hear me? I'll wait for a thumbs up to pop up. Just there you go. Thumbs up's there. Thank you, everyone. Off to a good start. As Rachel said, I'm John Hawkins, Director of Market Design at RECO, and I'm going to talk to you about the changes that we expect codes reform to have on the REC governance structure, what that means for you guys in terms of engagement, and some of the transitional arrangements of how do we get from the current governance structure to the new one, particularly in terms of changes to modifications or change proposals. If we go on to the first slide, there we are. So Rachel said, we appreciate that there'll be some people who are more familiar with what's been happening with codes form and some where this might be relatively new to them. I'm going to give a very high level background to it. So Ofgem are able to, through the Energy Act 2023, introduce a new code governance framework across all energy industry codes, and they've been working on a program for some time looking at the consolidation, simplification, and applying some consistency across how the various codes work and how their governance arrangements work. That involves Ofgem have designed some consistent approaches to some of the governance around codes. So everything from how forward planning, how budgeting works, the requirements for a stakeholder advisory forum, and how that will work consistently across the codes, a consistent modification process across codes as well, and a number of other aspects there. They're introducing the concept of licensed code managers. At the moment, codes are still predominantly industry run. Decisions are made by industry panels with volunteers from industry parties providing that role, and predominantly code administrators performing activities and running the governance arrangements on behalf of those panels. The REC moved a bit past that in its establishment. It was a bit of an early start at moving to a code manager model where the code manager had a lot more responsibility in decision making, but ultimately decisions relating to modifications and some other points were still made by industry panels. What will happen is with a licensed code manager, that will be a fully independent entity operating under a license granted by the regulator, and ultimately responsible for the decisions that the industry panels are making today. With that, stakeholder expertise remains central to that. There's a recognition throughout the programme and with anyone involved in the codes that no code manager will be in a position where it will be able to make good and constructive decisions without proper engagement with the people who ultimately have to deliver this, which are you guys. And that needs to be central to any process without decisions being made in an ivory tower. So while decisions are transferring out of the panels, that doesn't remove the need for industry engagement. It actually doubles down on that need. And then there needs to be a planned transition for that. So you can't just kind of go, well, we'll just run everything right up to the wire under the current arrangements and then hope it all works under the new arrangements. There has to be a bit of planning about how you get there. If we move on to the next slide, so in terms of what's specifically changing for the REC in relation to that, there will be a new code modification process. We call it a change process at the moment. It mostly follows the same structure as the existing process, and I think for those of you that are involved in dealing with multiple industry codes, they all broadly follow the same structure but all have their own way of doing it. And what Ofgem are looking to do is to bring some consistency in, which will hopefully support better alignment of cross-code modifications by the time all codes have transitioned to the new arrangements. Bringing in that consistency does change some of the lower level pieces of the way the REC manages it today. We're not going into the detail of that today, but we are going to arrange a separate webinar just to properly run through what that new modification process looks like in detail for those of you that do engage in it, and and would want to know what the difference in those lower level steps would be. With the move to the licensed co-manager model and the introduction of a stakeholder advisory forum, which Aisha is going to be talking to you about in more detail later, that has consequential impacts on the governance model. We have a number of panels today that are there predominantly for the purposes of making decisions and modifications. And so that moving away from those panels means we have to step back, review the future of those, and then look at how do we make sure we still have access to the appropriate expertise and industry have the access to engage in the process at the right time. That will lead to an evolution of the governance groups as well. So some of them will retain, but we may need to review the terms of reference or the cadence or other aspects of how those groups operate to make sure that that fits in with the future framework. And then with a new modification process, we will need to look at what that means for in-flight change and try to minimise any disruption of if something is happening at a slightly awkward stage of the process where it doesn't quite align. How do we plan for that and how do we make that work? So for those of you familiar with REC governance, this will be relatively familiar to you. This is how things are set up today at the moment. The RECO board has two primary subcommittees, which is the change panel and the performance assurance board. The change panel has responsibility for overseeing modifications and issues, and the performance assurance board oversees all of the assurance arrangements in the code. So ultimately making sure that we're managing market level risk and the parties are performing in the way they should be. The change panel has a number of subcommittees, two of which are other decision-making panels, so the metering expert panel and the technical expert panel, where they are able to delegate decisions to a more specific group of experts, where there is benefit in more specialist expertise being involved in the decisions for that. We also have a change issues group where we look at pre-modification issues, and a REC issues group where we look at operational issues predominantly to do with things like data cleanse and performance assurance. We have dedicated working groups where that's appropriate for particular issues or modifications, and then under the metering expert panel there are two operational forums where industry experts can get together to talk about operational issues relating to either gas metering or electricity metering. We have historically had other forums in the past that have stood up and stood down at the appropriate points, so this isn't a fixed model. So that's how things stand today. I said before, expertise remains at the heart of all of this. So when we look at all of this, all of these groups play a really valuable role today in the current governance arrangements, but some of the main reasons for some of them being there are either changing or being moved somewhere else, so we need to look at that. But we need to make sure that when we do that, we don't lose some of the positive benefits we get from those groups. So particularly groups like the metering expert panel and the technical expert panel, where we get some really great rich input from the experts close to the ground on that one, and we need to make sure we continue to seek that expertise before getting to decisions so that we can make sure those decisions are well informed. So what we need to think about is, under the new model, where is the appropriate place and the right engagement route to get that, as opposed to removing that in any particular way. And if we do it right, that enables probably a bit more flexibility and potentially more people to get involved in the process than under a fixed model. So we're hoping to look at this in a way that strengthens that engagement as opposed to remove it. So if we move on to the next slide, the way we might need to look at this here is the new process, for those who've been following it, has a requirement for industry engagement through work groups in relation to modifications by default. So it's not that the code manager needs to justify why a work group is needed, it needs to justify why a work group is not needed. You know, in that way, the evidence has to be that you have to prove why there isn't a need to bring a work group together to develop something, as opposed to why you do need it. And that work group can be through standing forums, such as we have our operational metering forums that are a good place where if we thought there was a metering specific work group that was needed, we have the option of saying, do we want to use that existing forum to act in the role of the work group, or do we want to stand up our own standalone work group or refer to another standing group? So thinking about those kind of things, when we get to the metering operational impacts there, it might be that we look to refer and use those operational metering forms in the development of modifications in a way that we don't currently do today, because we currently have other ways of managing that. For technical changes, if there isn't a standing group that's appropriate for that, then it may be that we need to stand up dedicated work groups to bring in the right technical experts for doing that. Similar when we look at cross-cutting modifications where they don't naturally sit in one place, that would likely be an appropriate point where we need to stand up a dedicated work group with the right with the right diverse set of skills and expertise. And then the early exploration of issues, or if there's just some basic testing that needs to be done with a modification, the new process requires the use of a pre-modification forum, which is currently what the change issues group does. So that type of forum will still need to be there for those kind of issues to be discussed. So if we work through what all of this means for the existing groups there, the change panel itself, the role of the change panel today of looking at approving the change plans, the change reports, and ultimately making decisions on issues and bringing that industry challenge into the process at those checkpoints, that is being almost completely divided into part of that is being superseded by the license code manager role, where the decisions will be made, and the industry engagement and challenge part is being superseded by the Stakeholder Advisory Forum. So that role is going to be completely superseded, and the change panel will be closed as the new SAF and the license co-manager model come into play. The Performance Assurance Board's role in its assurance capability isn't changing. So Ofgem consulted on this, and they considered whether there should be a change in where decision making sits, and concluded that that could remain as it is at the moment. But ultimately what happens is the direction of delegated authority changes. So rather than the Performance Assurance Board holding responsibility for decisions and delegating some down to the code manager, that basically flips. The code manager delegates the authority down to the Performance Assurance Board. But outside of it, for what the REC PAB is going to be doing, the proposal is that nothing's going to change at the start. Everything the PAB is responsible for today, they will continue to be responsible for tomorrow. The difference in that being that one of the things the PAB does at the moment is it is a committee that can make decisions on certain modification proposals when delegated by the change panel. So that part of the PAB will be removed. So the PAB will not be making decisions on modification proposals relating to performance assurance anymore, but it will still be an important stakeholder in that process. So as we would need to consult with industry experts at the right time if there was something that was impacting the assurance arrangements or particular market risks, the co-manager would need to engage with the PAB as part of the development ahead of making that decision to make sure that the PAB's view was appropriately taken into account. The metering expert panel and the technical expert panel were, I mentioned earlier, challenging ones to look at because they add a huge amount of value in the process today from the expertise point of view. But when we looked at this, and we looked at when you take that predominant decision-making role out of the process and you bring in the SAF, which will have that role and need to consider where its metering and technical expertise can support that, similar to the change panel, the majority that role is predominantly superseded. So we then looked at where would we still need those kind of standing operational forums that could refer to it there. And when we looked historically at the business of those groups, the majority of metering expert panel modifications tend to be related to single fuel issues, and there is an existing metering forum for single fuel issues there that is open to everyone as opposed to a closed group. And so we feel that's the more appropriate place to engage with industry. Those groups currently only meet once a quarter, so what that may mean is that we need to review the cadence of them, because if more is going to go to those groups, then that's going to have a greater role in engaging in the modification process, then once a quarter is likely not going to be sufficient. So one of the things we still need to do is review, and when we go and speak to the metering expert panel in a few weeks, we will need to review what is the appropriate cadence there. In the as I said before, the process allows for the standing up of targeted work groups. So if there was a kind of cross-cutting dual fuel metering issue, that would likely be something where a standalone work group would be the appropriate point there, and then the SAF performs that challenge role that the metering expert panel currently provides. Similar for the technical expert panel, there's the majority of modification proposals that go through there that require that kind of challenge tend to go through either the change issues group or a dedicated working group, and that looks like the right kind of place to develop that initially as well. And we couldn't quite see how a standing technical group would have enough business to meet on a regular basis. So at this stage, we don't see justification for standing up a technical forum. But as always with these things, they are fluid, and if we saw that there was enough business for that in the future, then that would be something that we'd look at. Moving on, I've mentioned the operational metering forums already. We see a future for those. They add value to industry today, and we think they could actually be built on and add greater value to bring in more engagement from those metering experts in the development of these modification proposals. So we see those being retained, terms of reference reviewed to make sure that they can accommodate the broader role, and reviewing the cadence of the meetings. We have a rec issues group and a change issues group at the moment that do two very different things, and we see both of those. Culture Reform isn't removing the need for any of those, so they'll both be there. But we have had feedback that it's slightly confusing having two issues groups or two groups with the word issues in it. And looking at aligning to future terminology, what the change issues group does today is it mostly fulfills the role of the pre-modification forum that will be required to have under the license. And we don't see that necessarily when we bring all of those kind of, that general group of industry experts together, that needing to be restricted to just pre-modification issues. There might be times where modifications themselves could be referred properly to that group of people. So our proposal there is we ultimately keep that format, but that would evolve to become what we'd call the modification forum, which would fulfill the needs of that pre-modification forum in the way CHIC does, but with the flexibility that it's not limited to just pre-modification issues. And the rec issues group, we would just look to, we're keeping that the same, but we're thinking of just changing the name of that just to be clearer that it's not related to what we call issues in relating to the change process. And then working groups as they stand will still be there, and where we need to stand up standalone working groups, that will be part of the process. What I haven't mentioned yet in relation to this, I've mentioned a lot around engagement, and I've mentioned around modification decisions. Some of these groups also have responsibility for overseeing what we call category 3 documents. So those are guidance documents or procedural documents that don't directly place obligations, but provide additional context or instruction relating to obligations set out in the code. The metering expert panel particularly look after quite a lot of these, and then other forums do pick up a few of them as well. So the standard point here will be that the formal decision part will transfer over to the code manager, but we recognise on these documents, particularly being more operational in nature, that ideally these things need to go through formal engagement and consensus where we can achieve consensus on the changes for them. So the process that we'll be following with it will be still looking at, you know, taking these through engagement at the relevant forums, or with work groups or with the SAF, depending on the right place for them, to make sure that we get that industry input, and where appropriate also that broader consultation on any changes to these documents. So the place in which the decision is made is likely to change, but the engagement route is still going to be there, and if anything should strengthen with that. There are category 3 documents that are assigned to the Performance Assurance Board, and as I said earlier, we're not changing the role of the Performance Assurance Board in any way. So all of those ones that PAB currently has responsibility for, they will still have responsibility for through delegated authority from the code manager. So what that means in terms of what the future governance framework would look like is, we had that one before. The PAB will still be there. Those decision-making subcommittees and the change panel are removed. The Stakeholder Advisory Forum will be there as a kind of, you know, that's not something that's subservient to the code manager or the board in any way. That's an independent forum that provides advice and challenge into that function. We would have the modification forum continuing the work of what is the cheek today. We would have the operational issues forum continuing the work of what is the rig today. We would still have work groups, and we would have the operational metering forums there. And that note there being that any of those standing forums we have could at any point, if appropriate, fulfill the role of a work group if that's where the right set of expertise sat. So I'm going to cover just a little bit on the transition, and then we I don't know, Rachel, if we're opening up to questions in between sections or at the end, but I'll refer to you on that one. When we looked at the transition there, you know, we had to kind of figure out what are the principles we're working to, and one of them is that nothing changes until it changes. So the existing governance and the existing decision-making bodies are in place until they're not. Yeah, so they are there and they're responsible until the point that the license takes effect and any new governance arrangements come into play. But we do want to mobilise the SAF early. I mean, you'll figure out here from here on what I've said already and what Aisha's going to go through, the absolute critical importance of the SAF in the new process. And we want to mobilise that and de-risk transition as early as we can do. What we can't do is have the SAF performing its role before it's effective in the code, but we can look at how do we get the SAF ready so that it's not starting from scratch on day one. We need to move in-flight change proposals at the right stage. So what we don't want to do is get to the transition point and all of a sudden have to do a lot of cleanup because we haven't thought about how things will move from one side of the process to the other. We need to make sure that we have a plan and an approach to do that. And that involves planning around those major milestones. So looking ahead at the portfolio and saying, what are those points in the process where things don't naturally move in a clean way, and what are those points we should be thinking about as a way to make it cleaner. So when we did that, we looked at the process and went, there's really three major points we need to consider here. One is when new change proposals come in, when does a new proposal need to follow the new modification process because it won't be in time to reach one of the existing panels, and therefore need to be considered under that new assessment framework. We have a process at the moment for REC issues where they can kind of convert to change proposals at an appropriate point. And the new process doesn't allow for that. It has a start and end for a pre-modification issue and a start and end for a modification proposal. So there will be a cut-off point where live issues, if they haven't converted to a change proposal, will need to close off under the new process and have a new modification proposal raised. And then decisions on live change proposals today, we were looking at what is the right point where a decision should be made before being carried over into the new process. We've worked these data on the basis of if the transition was the 30th of November. If the transition date changes, then these dates shift. So they are flexible at the moment, but it's on that basis there. And so on the basis of the current cycle of meetings, if the live date was the 30th of November, the last change panel would be on the 17th of November. So that's ultimately the final point in which a new proposal can be accepted and have its plan approved by the change panel under the legacy process. It's the final date the change panel can approve a modification when on receipt of its final modification report, and it's the what we think would be the final date for the conversion of issues to change proposals. There isn't the change panel doesn't really have a formal role in approving those today, but we think it's important for transparency that there's a bit of a line in the sand for industry. Everyone knows when something has moved over to a proposal stage or if it hasn't. So we're proposing that any issues that are moving over to the change proposal status would need to be baselined with the change panel in its final meeting. So there's a clear line in the sand for industry. And then when it comes to decisions, the ideal will be that if a decision is made in the if there's a decision made to approve a draft report and issue that for consultation in the new process, that ideally we would want the same panel making the decision to approve or reject that. And the reason for that is to make sure that there's not conflict between what may have been approved at the draft stage versus, you know, when a decision is ready to be made. That's not a hard rule, but it's something we think is good practice to try and align so that ultimately, if the change panel are approving that a report is ready to go to consultation, they are the ones that will ultimately make the decision on whether that proposal should be implemented. So that means that we need to consider when is a draft modification report ready to be approved for consultation, on the basis that that panel would have the opportunity to receive the final report following that consultation to make a decision. And that's what those middle roles are for each of those panels. So for the change panel, because it meets more frequently, there's a bit more flexibility depending on the length of the consultation. But for a basic 3-week consultation, they would need to receive the draft report by their meeting of the 15th of September in order to ensure there was sufficient time to approve that by their final meeting of the 17th of November. And working down for the MEP, the PAB and the TEP, similar dates there, they would need to receive that draft report in their September meeting to make a decision to approve or reject that in their November meeting. This is something where what we're doing is we're then working through the portfolio to go, is there anything that doesn't align with this? So ideally, if it wasn't going to be ready for September, would the draft report be ready after November when the new arrangements came in, and is there any crossover? And then we would deal with those crossovers by exception. Is it appropriate that we move that forward, that we push it back, or that we have a particular arrangement in place to de-risk any disagreement that could be there between the different decision makers, which shouldn't really be the case because we're normally aligning on a recommendation. So that's the approach that we're looking at for transition. And so the next steps for us are, over the next couple of months, we're going to be preparing for this. So I mentioned we're going to be reviewing all of the live proposals in the pipeline and looking at the impacts to that. We'll be then, where we need to make changes to the plans for those, we'll be presenting those and discussing those with the relevant committees, and not trying to have this slow us down too much and continuing to progress changes as they come in as fluidly as we can do. Rachel said we've got a few more conversations to have with some of the committees, and then we'll be finalising that model and then looking at the planning arrangements to make those changes. And then I said earlier, there's some further engagement we're looking at around hosting another webinar to focus on more detail of what that new modification process looks like. But that was it for me. Rachel.
John, we've had some really good questions come in. I think two of them would be worth responding to now, if you don't mind just coming back on. It's to do with the removal of the MEP and TEP and the process around ensuring that the code manager is considering specialist advice, etc. So, John, would you mind just coming back on to respond to those the two questions that we've had? Rebecca, we've also had a really great question from you in terms of the SAF pool. So I'm gonna hold off on responding to that question because we're going to go through the proposed composition around this around the SAF, including the SAF pool, in our next presentation. So, John, the first question was around the MEP and TEP, with the removal of the MEP and TEP. What's the processes that RECO is putting in place to ensure that specialist advice is adhered to, and the ability to remove and approve and reject mods have been removed from the MEP and TEP. So what does that look like in terms of our consultation with expertise, and how we are going to ensure within the new change process and utilising SAF that we're consulting with the right people and listening to that feedback?
Yeah, no, and there's a couple of answers to this one, because there's a few points through the process really where we do that. I think the first thing is when we get onto the SAF, and Aisha will talk about this a bit more there, making sure that expertise is available to the SAF is a critical component, because, like I say, we recognise the importance of that being there at those points in the process. So the SAF needs to, it's ultimately making sure it's a slightly different model, where instead of having a core group and delegated subgroups, it's making sure that core group has access to the appropriate expertise when doing that, and that's both through its core membership and potentially its pool members as well, where if particular people need to be brought in for certain discussions. The other part is, I mentioned there, around how do we strengthen that engagement with the wider metering expert community. So at the moment, the MEP is a fixed small group of on a constituency model, which works very well at the decision stage. But we still need to be engaging more broadly than that with that. And so the view is, as we're engaging with industry on the development of that, whether that's through a targeted work group or whether through things like the electricity or gas metering forums, engagement at that level and the development of it will help us get that expertise through the process before it gets there. And then the SAF provides that second line of defence, really, where having the right expertise there to challenge that at the various points in the process will pick that up. And then ultimately, under the new process, the code manager has the obligation to duly consider the views of the SAF, and ultimately to respond and justify where it disagrees with those views. It has to provide appropriate justification.
Thanks, John. And we've also had another question from Colin, which is in a similar theme, and it's around the transparency of the staff members and their votes around modifications and whether that's going to be published, etc. So could you just give a bit of flavour in terms of like the documentation and the visibility of the staff views and how we're going to be recording that with the modification reports, etc.
Yeah, so the SAF will be required to vote. So all SAF members will be required to vote on their recommendation. The SAF chair, who will be an independent member, is required then to draft the views of the SAF, and it will be the words of the SAF chair that are published in the modification report. So the code manager will not be providing, representing the views of the SAF in its own words. The independent chair will be doing that. Whether or not the chair is going to want kind of individual voting records, or whether it will be a summary, is something I believe we need to agree with the chair still. Although correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But yes, the SAF will independently vote. The chair will summarise whether it was a consensus position, a majority position, a split position, etc., in their own words, and then that will be what goes into the modification report. The SAF also will be doing their own assessment of the evaluation against the REC objectives. So there will be a proposer view. I want this modification, and this is why I think it better facilitates the objectives. There will be a SAF view, and there will be a code manager view. And what will be transparent is, you will be able to see what the different, if there are differences in those views, you will be able to see what those differences are and why.
Yeah, thanks, John. And this is probably an area we can provide a bit more visibility within our further webinar around modifications and what the interaction with the staff and the changes to the modification reports can look like. So something we can take away. Colin and Finn, I hope we've answered your questions initially. And Rebecca, like I said, we're just coming on to the staff now. So hopefully we can answer your question then. But if not, just let us know. So with that, I'm now going to pass you over to Aisha.
Thanks, Rachel and John. And yeah, hopefully you can hear me as well. So as you've heard, the new governance arrangements represent a significant change for the REC. But one thing that doesn't change is the importance of stakeholder advice and expertise in shaping modification decisions. So I'm going to talk you through how we're implementing the Stakeholder Advisory Forum for the REC. I'll explain what the SAF will do in practice, how we've approached composition and appointments, what we're looking for from prospective members, and a timetable around the nominations and elections arrangements, so that we have everything in place ahead of license commencement. So if you're considering becoming a SAF member or considering nominating someone from your organisation, hopefully this section will give you a clearer picture of what to expect and what the opportunities are to get involved are. So John's already covered this, but I'll just give a very quick background to the SAF. So formal decision making moves from the change panel to the license code manager. The Stakeholder Advisory Forum, or the SAF, is the new governance forum that Ofgem has established to support code managers in making those decisions. The SAF has a fixed membership, and that's made up of code party representatives, independent members, and consumer representatives. Its role is to provide advice, scrutiny, constructive challenge to the code manager before decisions are made. The SAF is an advisory body rather than a decision-making body. The code manager remains accountable for every modification decision, but it has to show due regard to the advice provided by the SAF, along with wider stakeholder engagement as well, and explain where it's reached a different conclusion. I think it's also worth highlighting that the SAF isn't just involved at the end of the modification process. Ofgem's draft code text requires the code manager to engage with the SAF throughout the modification lifecycle. So from those early stages of developing the proposals right through to the final recommendation. It'll also advise on broader areas such as how we're prioritising on modifications. We'll be consulting with them on areas such as our annual budget, our business plan, and also on code manager performance as per the licence requirements. So following on from Ofgem's publication of the draft code text, our focus has been on how we implement these arrangements into the REC. This means incorporating the code requirements into our governance framework. As John has covered as well, we're expecting to remove the existing change panel terms of reference and replace them with new terms of reference for the SAF. So these terms of reference will build on the requirements that will be set out in code through Ofgem's code modification code text and provide additional information on how the SAF will operate in practice. So things like membership appointments, meetings, ways of working, those will be given in more detail in the SAF terms of reference. And as with other governance documents, we'll consult on those through the direct change process. So there'll be an opportunity for stakeholders to review and comment before they're finalised. So moving on to the next slide, I thought it would be helpful just to think about the SAF in terms of what is their involvement during the modification process. So where a modification's been developed and is approaching an important decision point, what we're expecting is that the SAF will engage on areas that stakeholders would have expected us to have considered. So exploring areas like have we looked at the alternatives properly? Have we understood the impact on different parties? Are there any unintended consequences that we haven't picked up on? Does the proposal meet the code objectives? Has our evidence been sufficiently tested? So these are all the areas where I think the SAF has a really important role in playing. And as John outlined, the SAF doesn't replace wider stakeholder engagement. We'll have the work groups, consultations, the operational forums will continue to play an important role. But the SAF is there to bring those different perspectives together and provide that structured advice to help inform the code manager's decision. So on the next slide, we're looking at our proposals around the composition for the SAF and how we're approaching the appointments. So we're already well underway in terms of recruiting the independent SAF chair. We're using an external recruitment process and have provided a detailed role specification to really ensure that we get the capability required for the role, and also to ensure that appropriate independence from RECCO as well. Our intention is that the chair will be in place about 3 months ahead of the first SAF meeting, and in those 3 months we'll have a program of induction training and familiarisation that we'll create for that chair. Bringing the chair in early gives them that opportunity to understand the REC, observe current governance arrangements, and then contribute to the development of SAF's ways of working and the appointment of the wider membership. Based on some of the questions that have been asked, I think some of those issues will be ironed out as we develop those ways of working with the SAF chair. We're also looking to use the similar process to recruit other independent members, and we're looking at the moment at what that expertise is that we'll need. So in the presentation, there are some areas that we're thinking that we will need independent member support for. Then in developing our proposed code party composition, we've done our review of the REC change panel alongside the membership of our existing expert groups, the performance assurance board as well, and we looked to see where we can bring that consistent approach to representation across all the different party types, and also thinking about those operational roles involved in delivering the REC. We thought about whether there's any gaps in expertise or perspectives that we might want to address as well, either through code party representation, independent membership, or through that wider SAF pool, and that essentially helped us to ensure that those code party places are focused on those sectors where that ongoing operational experience is most valuable, but also retaining that flexibility to support the forum with additional expertise where it's needed. So again, in the slide, we've outlined the different types of code party representation that we think we'll need in the SAF. Compared to the current change panel, I think the principal changes are that separation of metering representation into dedicated gas and electricity representatives to better reflect the operational arrangements across the two fuels, and also the inclusion of DCC in its new role as the DCC2 Central Registration Service Provider. So with the introduction of the DCC2 model ahead of license grant, we think it's appropriate that DCC as code party is represented on the SAF as well. Also, just to let you know, we're currently engaging with Citizens Advice on consumer representation, and we'll be reaching out to Consumer Scotland as well. And then alongside the fixed membership, Ofgem's proposing a governance environment that includes the SAF pool as well. The pool's intended to provide access to additional expertise and perspectives where it's needed, rather than having every capability represented permanently within the core membership. The SAF pool is an area that we will have more of a flexible approach to, so we're not looking to recruit everyone up front, and we'll sort of respond to emerging priorities and align where appropriate with the appointments of other code managers as well. But I think picking up on the question that was asked on the chat, I think doing that analysis of where we've got that expertise already on the MEP and the TEP, and bringing that into the SAF pool, and thinking about how they get involved in the operational forums as well, I think will be a critical part of that. So with that view of not losing the expertise that we have at the moment, and I think the SAF pool does provide a really good place for some of that expertise to sit, and for us to be able to call on it as needed. So we're aiming to have the chair and the core SAF membership appointed, trained and ready to operate from the start of the new arrangements, while retaining that flexibility for the pool in response to sort of the ongoing needs. So on the next slide, we as part of the nominations and election process for the SAF code sets out a requirement for code managers to provide pre-election guidance and to include the types of expertise that are required. So as I outlined on the previous slide, the types of expertise we're looking for from party members, I also wanted to highlight some key guidance that I think would apply to all SAF members. So first of all, that commitment to actively participate as a SAF member. The SAF mandated role will require involvement from members early on in that modification process compared to change panel involvement, but also recognising it's a real opportunity to shape those modifications as well. Although members will bring valuable experience from their organisation and sectors, they won't be attending as delegates or representatives in that traditional sense. So the expectation is that they'll use that expertise and provide objective advice and constructive challenge in the interests of the REC as a whole. There'll be work required in terms of preparing for meetings, engaging throughout that modification process, challenging the assumptions and helping us to make better decisions. So yeah, there will be a focus on that. And I guess we really hope that code parties will embrace the opportunity to become members of the SAF. It's an opportunity to advise and challenge us to make good decisions. But ultimately, we recognise that SAF won't depend solely on the quality of its members. We recognise our role as a code manager to make those arrangements effective by providing high quality information papers, making sure members have enough time to consider them, being very clear in our explanation of issues, being transparent in decisions, demonstrating how we've taken stakeholder advice into account. It's very much a joint responsibility, I think, to make the SAF as effective as it could be. And also we will be providing induction training, ongoing support, so members have that ability to carry out that important new role. So in the next slide, I wanted to cover off the preliminary timescales for the Code Party nomination and election process. So the process here follows the arrangements set out in the draft code text, and there is the potential for that to be amended when we see that final code text. So so there is possibility for change there, but also as John outlined, we're working on that sort of indicative timescale of award of license by the end of November, and that has the potential to change. So we are sort of engaging with Ofgem and keeping abreast of that as well. So our current intention is to begin the process towards the end of August and to start the onboarding and training of SAF members a month before the first SAF meeting. Once we've launched our invitation, we propose to hold a drop-in session so that anyone who has any questions about the process, having reviewed the material that we've provided, have that opportunity to do so. But also just to highlight that you're welcome to get in touch with us at any point if you have any questions that you want to resolve. So yeah, please do feel free to reach out to us. I just wanted to highlight the information on the left-hand side that Code Parties will need to submit alongside the nomination process. And the aim is to ensure that members have both the experience and the independence to contribute effectively to the process. We're also looking at the potential to, in the event of a tied vote, to use the information that Code Parties submit to select the Code Party candidate as well. So just to wrap up, we're really keen to attract members who can bring both the expertise and the willingness to engage constructively through the modification process. We hope many of you will consider putting yourself forward or nominating colleagues that have the right skills and experience. We'll be shortly consulting on the SAF terms of reference through the change process, and we'll continue to engage with stakeholders as we develop the detailed arrangements and prepare for that first SAF meeting. So I'm not sure if there are any questions. Otherwise, I can hand you over to Tracy, who will talk through the mobilisation timetable.
Thanks, Aisha. No new questions have come in at the moment, but please do share them if you have any. Rebecca, hopefully Aisha covered your question. I think that the key point there is that it's hugely important to ensure that there's that flexibility with the SAF pool to continually review and the expertise that we have in that SAF pool. I think a big part of that also is in terms of who's appointed to the SAF in terms of the Code Party representation as well. So it's something that we'll be actively keeping under review. So yes, I'll pass you over to Tracy, and yes, if anyone has any more questions, please do share them in the Q&A function.
Thanks, Rachel. So I'm Tracy Hardy. I'm the project manager on RECO's Code Reform project. So we've heard from John on the code governance changes and transitional arrangements. Aisha's explained what the SAF is, the proposed composition, and how appointments will be made. And now I just want to spend the next few minutes walking you through the overall timeline of how we get from where we are today to a fully operational Stakeholder Advisory Forum and what's happening and when. So go on to the next slide. So let's start with where we are now and what we've been doing over June and July. As you've already heard, we've been finalising the SAF chair role specification. We've advertised the role, started interviewing. We've been creating guidance documents for prospective SAF members. So completing a gap analysis as well on determining the right composition, essentially confirming the expertise and representation that the form will need. So when appointments are made, we're making sure that we get the right mix of skills and expertise on that SAF. Then if we look forward into August and early September, and we have our first major milestone for the SAF, which is appointment of the SAF chair. As I said, we're recruiting an independent SAF chair with the help of external recruiters, and our aim is to confirm that appointment around about end of August, early September time. We want to recruit the chair first because they will help us set the tone and the ways of working for everybody that follows. So once appointed, the chair moves into that induction period, around about 3 months onboarding and training, and that will include shadowing the existing change panel, so they understand the current governance arrangements before we transition over to those new arrangements which are required for us under licence. So then if we look into late August and into September time, and that's when the membership process really opens up. As Aisha covered, the formal invitation and guidance for co-party nominations will launch around about the week commencing 31st of August. We will then follow this with a stakeholder drop-in session in early September. So there will be a chance there for those who are interested to ask questions directly on that one-to-one basis. And then we are aiming to close nominations and confirm the candidate list in the week of the 21st of September. Alongside that co-party route, the independent members and the SME pool, so subject matter experts pool appointments, will also begin in September. We're engaging with Citizens Advice and Consumer Scotland on consumer representation as well. So lots of activity going on there in September. We then look forward into October and November, and that's when we bring it all together at that point, and we start to confirm the membership. So for co-parties, voting closes, and we are aiming to confirm results in mid-October, with appointments of the SAF members being confirmed by the end of October. Independent members and the SME pool will also be appointed by late October. So that means around about a month ahead of licence grant, we expect to have the full forum in place. So onboarding and training for that wider membership group will then take place in that final month before the licence comes into effect. Just want to take a second here to flag how that connects to the transitional dates you heard about earlier from John. Current governance model, which includes the change panel, the MEP, the TEP and the PAB, that all remains in place as is today, with all existing responsibilities right up to the licence effective date. We're mobilising the SAF early precisely so that we're ready when we need to be, and to de-risk that handover period rather than leaving any sort of gap. So that then brings us on to the final phase, which is November into December. And this is where the Code Manager licence commences and we enter the first SAF operating cycle. First SAF meeting will take place shortly after the licence award. And that by that point, the terms of reference, operational model and the schedule updates will all be confirmed and will have defined the forum's first 6 months of agendas. So throughout all of this, we're making sure that we build in regular communication checkpoints so everyone's kept informed of progress. There'll be announcements at chair appointment. There will be updates on member selection around about mid-process and also at member appointment. And we'll also continue engaging the existing rec committees on the transition as we go through the process. However, please feel free to reach out with any questions that you have anytime as we go through this process. So to sum up, groundwork now, chair confirmed end of August, early September, 3 months ahead of licence grant, membership nominations and voting through September and October, with appointments made a month ahead of licence grant, and the first SAF meeting shortly after licence grant. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So that's the mobilisation timeline for the forum itself, but the SAF will not operate in isolation. And I'm just going to use these last couple of minutes to look at the wider work that's happening in parallel as we prepare for the Code Manager licence. There's 3 areas here on the horizon, and each has its own timeline running alongside the one we've just walked through. So the first is developing our cross-code arrangements, and the preparatory work for this has been going on for a number of months and will continue through to October. As governance moves to a common framework across the energy codes, we need to work with the other code bodies to agree the scope of the cross-code steering group, the CCSG. And that means sitting down with the other code bodies, not just the REC and the BSC, to define what the group covers and how it will operate. We'll amend the CCSG terms of reference through a formal change process, so that's done transparently and in line with governance. And we'll also be looking to appoint and onboard an independent CCSG chair. So while the SAF is being stood up, the cross-code work is happening at the same time, making sure the REC connects to the wider reform landscape. And this leads nicely onto that second area of the REC delivery plan, as this will be a core focus of the CCSG in coordinating delivery across the codes. The work on the REC delivery plan spans from September through to December. Delivery plan is essentially how we translate strategy into a concrete programme of work. It will be developed based on Ofgem's strategic direction statement decision, which we expect in September time. Once the SDS is designated, the REC delivery plan becomes a formal plan for delivering it. And there's an important connection here. The delivery plan consultation will form part of our forward work plan consultation, something that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So these two pieces of work come together rather than running as separate exercises, which hopefully keeps things much simpler for stakeholders by giving you a joined up picture. Third area is consultation on the budget and the forward work plan, and this runs from December into January. This consultation is undertaken in accordance with the licence requirements. So it's formal obligation once the licence comes into effect. So one thing to note here is we are publishing this consultation earlier than you might be used to or expecting, around about mid-December time. So we've done that deliberately to give stakeholders more time to review it. We all know December's a pretty busy month for everyone. So the responses deadline will stay broadly consistent with current timescales. So it's genuinely about giving more time for reading and responding to that rather than compressing timescales. And as I mentioned, the delivery plan consultation will form part of this same forward work plan consultation. So if we look at all these together now, you can see how they all interconnect. Cross-code arrangements come in first over the summer and early autumn. Delivery plan builds through the autumn once Ofgem's decision on the SDS lands. And the budget and the forward work plan consultation comes at the end of the year and into the start of next year. If you layer that over with the SAF mobilisation timeline, you see everything you've heard today. You get that sense of everything that's needing to be coordinated to have everything ready for the code manager licence. I'll close with the same message we've heard throughout this session. We'll continue to engage with stakeholders, provide regular updates as we go through, but please do keep talking to us and send through questions as and when they come to you. So with that, I will hand back to Rachel if we've got any time for Q&A.
Yeah, we've got 1 minute left. We haven't had any other additional questions, but that doesn't mean that we won't answer any more questions. So if you'd like to send any questions to us, please do so following this meeting. On the next slide, there is an email address for you to get in contact with us. And if you send any questions to us after this session, we'll make sure that we incorporate that in the final written up Q&A that we share with all participants. So I just wanted to say a massive thank you for everyone joining us today. Thank you for the engagement and the questions that we had both prior to this session, but also within the session as well. I hope you found it useful. We're just going to quickly post an after meeting survey just to get your initial feedback. But it's been great speaking to you guys all today. This is the first of many engagements that we'll continue with as we approach licence grants. So looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks, everyone.